Hey, good morning. This is Bruce Starr, your state senator from Senate District 12, representing Yamhill and Polk counties. Welcome to Conversations with Bruce Starr. I think this is episode 3. This morning, we are going to have, I think, a really good conversation with a longtime friend of mine who happens to also have a title. And the title's not legislator. The title is lobbyist. And we're going to talk about how important it is to have lobbyists that are in the building that are ethical and work hard and represent real Oregonians, and the importance that they play to the whole legislative process and ultimately making the process work, and I think work better. So stay tuned for this important conversation, and I'm so glad you're here. Hey, good morning, Doug Riggs. How are you?
Morning. Happy Thursday.
Welcome to Conversations with Bruce Starr.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Well, I don't know.
No, I've never been on such a show.
I don't know how impressive it really is, but at least we have an opportunity to chat. And
millions of followers and international
hundreds
audience.
of millions.
Yeah, after this one, it might shrink.
No, come on now. Come on. So I do appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes, and you have a unique kind of professional story, I think. And let's start where it started. And you're a Central Oregon born and bred Oregonian. So
Yep.
in a relatively short period of time, kind of nutshell. Growing up in Central Oregon, you come from a family that modeled public service, and that led you to make some decisions about where you ended up early in your life. So, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. That's very true. I'm a fifth generation Oregonian. My great-great-grandparents came over to Oregon on the Oregon Trail in 1848 and 1852. In fact, it's kind of interesting driving up the street here in Salem, drove by North Salem High School, which used to be Salem High School, which is where my ancestors all went to school. But I grew up in Redmond,
right,
and consider myself a Central Oregonian. Grew up on a 13-acre farm.
Oh, wow.
We had, it wasn't a professional, active working farm, but we had horses and sheep and ducks and chickens, and I had to get up at 5 o'clock every morning and go down into the canyon because most of our acreage was in the Redmond Canyon.
Oh, wow.
And take care of the animals. That's all now a park. My dad, when he was the mayor, one of the things he did is he set aside the entire canyon as parkland. So,
that's cool.
Yeah, so grew up there, went to college for music. I was a music performance major. Somehow ended up in Washington, D.C., working for Senator Mark Hatfield, which is great, fantastic experience.
So did you work for him as an intern, or did you go immediately, in some kind of lofty paid position?
No, a very unlofty position. I started out as an intern, first in Washington, D.C., and as an intern, you do everything.
Right.
You open mail, you answer the phone, you sit at the front desk. I remember sitting at the front desk a few times when Senator Ted Kennedy came in.
Oh, yeah.
And he had to wait for Senator Hatfield to be available, and so he and I sat there and talked quite a bit, actually.
Interesting.
Back in the day, a long time ago. But I will say Senator Hatfield was a great man, a great boss, and certainly a great senator for the state of Oregon.
So do you have that iconic interview that everybody talks about with Jerry Frank?
Oh, yeah. That's surprising you ask. Yeah, I had, as a 21-year-old college kid, came down to Salem and sat in this very, dimly lit room with pictures of every world leader, Margaret Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth, Gandhi, and so you're sitting here as a 21-year-old, completely intimidated,
right?
As Jerry Frank is sitting across, looking at you and asking you very tough questions, and then these long pauses. So it was terrifying, and I thought there was no way I got this job. And then next thing I know, I got a letter, a very official letter on letterhead, gold leaf, saying congratulations.
Those Jerry Frank interviews are
notorious.
Yes, notorious is a good example.
Turned out he was a great guy to work with.
Yeah,
very professional.
No question.
Knew what he was doing, and he really wanted to put people through the ringer and know what to expect, and he expected a very high standard because the senator expected to be able to represent the state of Oregon
Right.
on an effective basis.
Yeah. So Hatfield in D.C., what happened? Where'd that end up taking you?
Well, it started out in D.C., and they apparently must have liked me because they put me on part-time in Portland. So I worked at Pioneer Courthouse Square
Oh, wow.
for about a year. And then when I graduated and came back to Washington, D.C., worked for a few weeks before I got a full-time job on the House side,
Right.
House of Representatives.
Was that when you worked for Cox?
I worked for Chris Cox from California, David Dreyer from California, and then a guy named Doc Hastings from Eastern Washington.
Oh, right.
Kept trying to get back to work for Oregonians. And I finally, in 1998, after I decided that 12 years in D.C. was enough, time to come home, it was the day that the moving trucks were coming to move me back to Oregon. I got a call from Senator Gordon Smith's office. Come in, he wants to see you. And he offered me a job, but I had already made the decision to come back. So I would have loved to have worked for Gordon Smith. He was also a great senator.
Right.
But we had a 15-month-old daughter, and it was time to come home.
Yeah.
D.C. is not a great place to raise a family. So it was
It's
time to come home.
not.
No, it's not.
And that was how long ago? And it's even gotten better.
Well, yeah, that was a while ago.
Right.
Exactly.
So while you were working on the Hill, you had some. Let's just talk real briefly about kind of some of the cool opportunities you had. Codels, which are, tell the listeners what a Codel is.
Congressional delegation, Codel,
Okay. Yeah.
and it's an overseas trip or fact-finding mission, educational visit. You know, sometimes they call
A junket?
Sometimes they call them junkets. The places I tended to go were not the typical locations of junkets. So
Wasn't the lap of luxury?
the one very nice trip I took was to Eastern Europe. My boss at the time, David Dreyer, was the chairman of the House of Representatives, and the Senate put together a group to help democracies emerging out of the former Soviet Union. So Hungary,
Yeah.
Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic,
Right.
and Poland in particular, helping them establish their legislative processes, their rules for parliament.
Creating civil society.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And so I helped write a couple of the bills that did that, and then I got to go to Eastern Europe a couple times.
So but you also went to places that weren't so glamorous. Some places that maybe were quite dangerous.
Yeah, both of my bosses from California were on either the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Foreign Affairs Task Force or the Armed Services Committee, and so, and one of my bosses, David Dreyer, was one of the key architects of helping the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Wow.
So the rebels fighting against Soviet control,
Right.
And so we were very involved in that effort. So I did go to places like Pakistan and over the border
So that
in
was
Afghanistan,
if
Angola.
If anybody's read Charlie Wilson's War or happened to see the movie, that was
Yes.
kind of in that time frame, correct?
That was exactly the time frame, and there's a backstory in that there were two legislators, members of Congress, who were really the architects of that. One was Charlie Wilson, the other was David Dreyer, but I don't think Dreyer wanted to be in the book. I don't think he wanted to be in the movie. He was always, kind of the behind the scenes mover and shaker of the Republicans.
Former Congressman, now deceased, Charlie Wilson was a little flamboyant, among other things.
He was a great man, a great character, and had great staff. My counterpart in Charlie Wilson's office was an amazing person.
Yeah. Well,
And they did the bulk of the work, but I got to tag along and go on these, junkets.
So yeah, but that it's kind of exciting relatively young, probably late 20s, maybe early 30s.
Late 20s, early 30s. Yeah, I mean, in Angola, we were in eastern Angola with Jonas Savimbi, the rebel leader, and all of his people. And in the middle of the night, our village got bombed by the MPLA, which was the communist government. So yeah, it was exciting.
Yeah. Front row to some history. That you read about in history books today.
Yeah, it was eye-opening to be in some of those places. To see the poverty in Angola, in particular. They were in the middle of an 8 or 10-year drought, and you go out into the villages, and people were malnourished, just like the pictures you see on TV. So really sad, very unfortunate, and the U.S. was trying to help. They were sending humanitarian supplies to Angola, and our job was, on both of my trips, was to see, was the aid that we were sending there actually helping the people?
Getting to where it was supposed to go.
And I'm not sure it was.
Yeah.
And that was our report back to the Congress.
Yeah. Well, now we have a president that's basically saying, hey, we're going to be very, very careful about where we send U.S. tax dollars overseas.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think there was back then, there probably still is an awful lot of fraud and skimming money off the top. You look at the number of Afghan leaders who are now living in Qatar with millions of dollars in money that they took from the pallets of money that the U.S. was giving to Afghanistan, supposedly to help the army or to help the people or to help economic development, and much of that money disappeared.
So I want to shift here in a minute to kind of your life as you moved from D.C. back to Oregon. But I want you to talk for just 30 seconds maybe to young Oregonians that may be watching this about how
The millions of young Oregonians
millions upon millions, but that are watching this that could say, hey, maybe there's an opportunity for me if I applied for that internship, and creating an opportunity to serve, whether it's an intern or ultimately a staff in DC. What does that mean as it relates to a young person's career path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I stumbled into it. I was in college and I was a music major, and at the time, being a professional French horn player in an orchestra was beginning to look increasingly bleak as far as opportunities.
Yeah,
orchestras were going bankrupt left and right at the time. The Oregon Symphony barely hung on. But Louisville went under, and San Antonio Symphony closed, and you could go down to Tulsa Symphony closed. So there was a long list of.
Sure.
So it was a bad time to be in music. So I decided, I'll follow my girlfriend back to DC on an internship, and that's what I did. And so I think you're exactly right. The internship really opened up my eyes to the possibility.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the. If I have a regret, kind of in all of my life, all the opportunities I had, I never worked in DC as an intern. And so many people that are in politics, I mean, that's one of the boxes that gets checked.
Right.
Most, again, we're not across the street from the Capitol, we're down the street and around the corner, but a lot of folks that are in that building that you and I visit virtually every day during the legislative session did have that experience,
right.
And I know there's a great camaraderie among like the former Hatfield staffers and, Gordon Smith staffers and Greg Walden staffers.
Right.
Those are all Republicans. Obviously, they have the similar experience and folks on the other side of the aisle. Yeah. But that's one of the fraternities that this legislator didn't have the opportunity. So if I have a minor regret, that's one of them. And thankfully, my daughter did have those opportunities, and she's still on the Hill.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. She is followed in her father's footsteps
to some degree,
and working for a great senator, very active and quite a character in his own right.
Yeah, for sure. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma. That's
right.
Who my daughter works for. Yeah. So, and if you follow any of the news lately, Senator Mullen has been all over TV as a very ardent supporter of President Trump. So, in the Trump's cabinet. So.
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
But able to roll up his sleeves and get things done across the aisle, working with organized labor, or working with the infamous incident with the Teamsters leader led to a friendship that I think they're going to get some things done. And that's, I think, in politics, that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see people who are able to put politics aside and work across the aisle. And I often see that in Salem. Maybe less in DC than we used to see it, but still, it's a good thing.
Yeah, so that's a great transition. Thank you so much for talking about what's happening in the state capitol. So you moved back to Oregon, and after spending a dozen years on the Hill, got a young family, and all of a sudden you had this opportunity to be a lobbyist.
It's the only thing that someone would hire me to do, and that is the honest truth. I was in DC, and I was a pretty senior staffer in my early 30s. When you're in your early 30s in the House, you've been there 11, 12 years. You've moved up the ranks. You know everyone. It's a very small world on the House side, and that kind of tenure is unusual for someone to stay there that long. Most people stay 2 years or 2.5 years in D.C. I really enjoyed it, but it's 80-hour weeks, 90-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks. I worked every weekend my entire time there. The only time I was ever caught up was the last day before I left, because I spent 3 weekends in a row trying to make sure I got through everything, so I didn't leave anything for my the person who was replacing me. But it took me 13 months to find a job.
Oh, wow.
I thought that based on my experience that someone would recognize that I could multitask and I knew lots of issues.
Sure.
But people pegged me as you know DC policy and that's it. Those are the skills you have.
Yeah.
So I did get an offer. So I was applying with Nike and Intel, thinking one of these big companies might want to hire me, but it didn't work out. Got hired by another lobby public relations firm, fairly big here in Oregon.
Right.
Former state senator ran it, gave me an opportunity, and I really appreciated that. Paul Phillips.
Yeah.
And it was fast and furious. He had a lot of clients on a lot of sides of the issues sometimes. And I was. By the time I left, as one of the senior people, I had 17 different clients I was responsible for, and that was a really tough job to be on top of that many issues.
A lot of balls you're juggling.
Yep.
So, and that's where you and I met. Is when you were working for Paul, and this young kid from Hillsboro kind of walked in the door saying, "Hey, I'm going to run for the legislature."
Yes, I remember that well.
Yeah, and
then you got elected.
Well, and how did I get elected? Because Doug Riggs and the team at Pac West managed that campaign. So
I think you got elected because you had skills. You ran a good campaign. People liked you. I mean, that I think really is a key in Oregon politics. Oregon is not DC.
Right.
So I think even today, if you're a candidate who has some connections with the community, and obviously, your father had been elected, and people liked your father, and you had name ID, but people liked you as a person.
Yeah.
And that it really is retail politics. You got to be able to knock on the doors and meet people in the town halls and talk to the Rotary clubs. And in a small district, word spreads quickly.
Yeah. So obviously, as a young kid growing up in Central Oregon, I don't think you had a dream of ultimately becoming a lobbyist.
No one dreams of being a lobbyist when they're a kid.
Yeah.
It's when they ask you in first grade. And I remember my first grade teacher asking me, asking everyone in the class at Edwin Brown Elementary School, what do you want to be when you grow up? And not one of us in my class said lobbyist. I mean, that's probably too long of a word.
What is it normally? You want to be a fireman? You want to
astronaut? Fireman.
You want to be in the NBA or the NFL?
Yeah. Well, my chances of being in the NBA or the NFL were slim to none. It's not going to happen.
So you went to work at Pac West, and then at some point you decided that you wanted to create your own firm. How was that transition? And basically acquiring clients and building your own book of quote unquote book of business.
Yeah, good question. I was at Pac West for 5 years, a little over 5 years, and it's back to what I said earlier. I felt like I was stretched too thin, and that I was not able to effectively represent my clients. And lobbyist is I think most people think is a 4-letter word. We're categorized with probably used car salesman, and I don't know what other professions have a negative opinion of the public. But in essence, if you're a business owner, you're a chamber of commerce in a local town, or you're a nonprofit or a city government, you have to focus your daily life on making sure your business is operating. If you own a small technology company, you've got to make sure that you're pursuing your technology that you're working on. If you're a city, you've got to make sure that the roads are plowed in the winter and that the streets are maintained and that the sewer works. I mean, so if you're a mayor, a councilor, and a staff, that's what you have to do. You don't have time to be in Salem every single day.
Right.
So what my clients are largely cities, counties, and then nonprofits working a lot with children's programs. And then I've got some business clients. That's what they have to do 24/7.
Yeah, they're busy running their enterprise.
Right.
They don't have time to monitor what's the legislative committees happening in the Oregon State Capitol.
Right. So what we are essentially their eyes and ears.
Yeah.
So we are in the building every day. So if the legislature decides to do something either good or bad for them, we can alert them to that possibility and say, hey, let's write a letter. Let's testify on a bill. Let's come over and sit down with Senator Starr and tell him why that bill would really be detrimental to a policy that might be occurring. So that's really what we do, and I wanted to be able to focus more time for my clients on that. So that's really why I decided to make the jump and form my own very small company. The most employees I've ever had is 2, and I currently have 1.5 right now, and they're great.
Yeah,
have about 10 clients, and again, they kind of break down into those 3 areas, and I feel like I can spend enough time to keep on top of things.
So what's the day, the average day in the life of a lobbyist when the legislature's in session? Because we're not always in session, but when we're in session, what does that look like for a typical lobbyist?
Great question. I would say that's true that you're not always in session, but you're always working. So you might, even when legislators are not in Salem in the Capitol, it is becoming pretty much a full-time job. So even the interim, you're all busy. So I'll say that the job is easier today than it used to be.
It's easier?
Easier.
Oh, interesting.
From just a technological standpoint.
Okay.
So 10 or 15 years ago, there wasn't an electronic website where you could, log in every morning and see, here's the hearing schedule and here are all the bills, and you could look at the bill and you could send it.
They used to print the daily calendar.
Right.
And
everything was printed.
Yeah, and you had to go and go to the bill room or and grab that, and then you'd have to manually scan all those committee meetings to see, or you'd have to check on the board outside of each chamber because that was the official posting.
Right, and we would all stand at the board waiting for someone from the legislative offices to come up and thumbtack the hearing announcements onto
the agenda,
and then we'd all be crowded around.
Yeah.
The worst though is the way we kept track of what was happening on a particular day is the faxes would start going out at 4:00 in the morning. So I would go to my office at 4:30.
Wow.
Almost every morning, and I'd have this gigantic pile of that oiled fax paper that would have rolled off my fax, just in a complete mess on my floor, and I'd have to say, okay, which committee is meeting where? So I will say that it's a little bit easier. So my morning is I get up at 5 or 5:30, and I go downstairs, let the dogs out, feed the cat, grab a cup of coffee, and I sit in front of my computer and every morning look through all the committee hearings and see what bills are coming up. And we have a bill tracking service now that alerts us pretty quickly if something gets scheduled, so we can look and see if a bill is being on the schedule to be heard.
Yeah. So, and then you stay in your pajamas in your office at home, and you log into the Capitol because everything's online. You can testify remotely.
Yeah,
I mean, you have legislators who are willing to take
remote meetings,
and you're in your slippers and your pajamas all day. And
I don't own a pair of pajamas, or slippers, but no.
That's not how it is?
There may be some people who do that, but
that was definitely how it was done during COVID.
Yeah.
But and unfortunately, there's some what's the right word? That continues, at least in some circumstances.
Yeah,
frustrating for a legislator who does not appreciate all that remote stuff.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think there are some people who might still do that. And I do think that having everything online is really an advantage to the public.
Right. They can see everything.
I have a number of clients in Central Oregon.
Sure.
I work with 8 cities and Deschutes County and Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council and other folks in Central Oregon. And especially in the winter when there's, 5 feet of snow that's fallen overnight on the Sandium Pass,
Right.
or it's very icy, it is good for them to be able to hook up with their legislature.
Yep.
But I think that the Oregon legislature is an important place to be in person, and that those relationships you develop. I mean, I will say that I honestly think that the most important thing that we all as lobbyists need to do, and this is kind of a misnomer, honestly, we can't be dishonest. We really have to represent the truth with a legislator. I mean, if I come in and I say, Senator Starr, that bill to transfer jurisdiction of a state highway to a city would cost the state $33 billion. And that turns out not to be true. And so I've told you something that's not true. And then you might say that same thing in a hearing, as Doug Riggs told you that. You won't come back to me. And the next time I come in, you're probably going to say, well, Doug Riggs said it was $33 billion. It's only $3 million. So I think we have to be careful to keep the relationships, and the relationships are developed through dealing with people. I mean,
Right.
There are always going to be things you run into where there'll be conflict, but
course.
I like to go into a meeting and say, this is what I believe, this is what my partners or my clients believe. You might hear from the other side something like XYZ. So
Right.
that way a legislator is not surprised.
Yeah. No, it's super helpful to have lobbyists basically communicate what both sides of an issue is.
Mm-hmm.
If you're advocating on one side, make your case, but basically saying, hey, these are what the other side's going to say, and that's helpful because it lays out the issues, and as a legislator, then you get to weigh the pros and cons, and ultimately come to a decision that you believe is the right path for the state. So, do you ever run into kind of an ethical dilemma? Have you ever had a lobby or a client suggest you to lobby a particular issue, maybe that you personally felt like it wasn't the right thing to do, or has that ever happened? Or if it hasn't happened to you, have you heard of it? Maybe one of your colleagues across the way.
I think that it's our responsibility and our job to try to avoid those situations, to avoid conflicts of interest, and to avoid ethical dilemmas. A large part of that is on who we accept as clients, and the advantage that I have of being a small firm that I control is I won't take clients who I disagree with or who I think might skirt that ethical line. And I have been asked in the past, hey, come and work for us, come and represent us. And I have said to several organizations, no.
Yeah.
Clients who said, on pharmaceutical reform, we want you to oppose bills that would give consumers more information about drug prices. And I just didn't think that was right.
Yeah.
I think consumers should have more information about, what is the price of a drug that they're going to be prescribed.
Yeah.
Let the consumer make their own decision. So that's one example. Conflicts, I'm only really on it because I have been careful not to take clients that conflict with each other.
Right.
And I really try to keep my clients in kind of groups of issue areas. I've really only had one where at first it looked like there was a conflict. Like I represented a large group of statewide low-income health clinics. And then I also worked with some coordinated care organizations. And at first it appeared like they might have a conflicting view on an issue.
Right.
And what I did is I said, hey, I think you might be conflicting on this issue. Why don't you come down and I'll set up a meeting? And so the two groups came and they had lunch, and I didn't go. They came back from lunch. They said, we found out we agree. And so
where you thought there might be a potential conflict, ultimately
there was,
you addressed it as a responsible human being. You address it straight on and say, hey, let's make sure that I'm going to be able to serve you both well. And
right.
If ultimately that conversation had come back different, you probably would have had to say, I'm sorry, I can't represent you, or I can't represent you, and
correct.
You've been and be able to go forward. Well, that's interesting. So, what is the proudest Doug Riggs lobbyist achievement, in your many years now, no, your years of lobbying,
my short legislative career.
Yeah. So is there an issue or a circumstance that stands out that you worked really hard on and ultimately, made a difference, not only for your client, but potentially for citizens in the state?
Well, I think I'd point to two things. Number one wasn't a bill, but it was a series of bills that all the interests in Central Oregon passed, starting back early in your career. The Central Oregon area, the Deschutes Basin, was facing a moratorium on development and on water rights because of a federal decision. And so the entire basin got together and decided that they needed to create a separate statute that in Oregon governed how you allocated limited water rights in the basin.
Yeah,
And-
complicated and
Yeah.
controversial.
Yeah, very complicated. And we had to work through, work with the environmental groups. We had to work with the fishing groups. We had to work with the agriculture folks, the irrigators. At the end of the day, in 2001 and 3 and 5, we passed what became known as the Deschutes Mitigation and Conservation Program. Among the things it did is, number one, it increased flows in the middle Deschutes by 4 times.
Wow.
So that's really an amazing ecological improvement. But it also allowed us to meet the demands of growth. People have been moving to Central Oregon. It forced cities to conserve water. For instance, Bend has a great statistic that in the last decade or so, they've grown by 38%, but their water consumption has only increased by 8%. So there's a tremendous amount of water conservation that has been accomplished. We've reopened sections of streams and tributaries like Weiches Creek up around the Sisters area that, really is an amazing program and process and helped with issues in the Crooked. So it has taken on a life of its own, far beyond just passing bills, but we were kind of the ringleader and helped coordinate that effort.
Yeah,
so I think that's one area that I'm proud of.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. So I'm reminded of the saying from my former colleague, Senator Ted Ferrioli, when he would say, "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting."
Yeah,
So,
that's exactly right.
yeah.
He and his colleague Bob Jensen
Oh yeah.
both used that, and Jackie Dingfelter. And this gets back to something I said earlier, which is I think that the building can be very bipartisan on a lot of these issues, and that's a great example. That was a bill that former Representative and Senator Ben Westland, God rest his soul, great man, died of cancer.
Yeah.
But he and others helped kind of start that program along with former Senator Neil Bryant. But it was the two, Jackie Dingfelder, Bob Jensen,
Yep.
in the House.
Jackie's from liberal Multnomah County,
East Portland, yeah.
So you had a Portland, quote unquote, Portland liberal working hand in hand with a very conservative Pendleton Republican. Yeah.
Right. In the Senate, it was Westland who worked with Charlie Ringo and Kate Brown.
Yeah.
Who then became governor. So
Yeah.
that was a heavy lift. It took multiple sessions. It's been the foundation of what we've done in the basin with water. There's now a Deschutes Water Conservation Alliance. There's the Deschutes River Conservancy. It's a much bigger. It's grown far beyond Doug Riggs' involvement. It really is it's a very impressive group, and I'm just watching from the sidelines largely right now.
Yeah. Well, that's very cool.
Yeah.
So we're right smack dab in the middle of a legislative session. Taking a break to come over here this morning to have a conversation. And, I asked earlier kind of what in the day in the life of Doug Riggs. So I don't think we finished the day. I mean, I think we left that story. You were, having a cup of coffee.
Got distracted.
Well, that's what a conversation's about.
That's true.
Kind of goes this way and that.
Yeah.
So you do show up in the Capitol virtually every day, right?
Yeah.
Whenever the legislature's in session, you are in the building.
Yeah. I try to be there on Fridays too, even if there's only one committee hearing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Sometimes I'm in Ways and Means on Fridays, and there might be one or two of us who are the lobbyists.
Yeah.
They're agency people, they're staff, but I really do think that, my job is to be there, and it's a good opportunity to talk to people. Again, I think the legislature is a relationship business. I try to have good relationships with all the legislators.
Right.
I think most of them, 90%, I have good relationships. Some I don't, don't have
You just don't have to
work with them on the
there's-
committees.
Right. There's no bills of your clients and their committees, so you have very little interaction.
Yeah. But as for my day, I show up, try to get there before the hearings start. Today there are 8:00 hearings, and I'm not there right now, but Emma, who works with me, is.
Right.
I will have bills that we're tracking that are being heard. So maybe I will have a client testifying remotely, as you mentioned, or in person.
Right.
Lately, there have been work sessions, which is the opportunity to vote on those bills and pass them.
Right.
So I have to track those. And then every day, another issue comes up, something that wasn't expected. So there are, the other thing is that the whole building, this, I mean, you've been very effective at rolling your sleeves up and working with people on your side of the aisle, the other side of the aisle. It takes collaborations, both from your side as the elected side and from the advocacy side. I mean, we're advocates, I like to say, for truth and justice.
Right on. The American way.
Yeah,
Apple pie and
right. So
motherhood.
As we advocate for truth and justice, we need to find other people who also want to advocate for those things, and we tend to work together.
Good.
So there are collaborations of the advocates, lobbyists,
Yeah.
and collaborations of legislators, and collaborations of other folks too.
Yeah. Interest groups.
Yeah.
So, and then in between committee meetings, you're meeting with legislative members, working with legislative staff.
Yeah.
I mean, staff are pretty important in this process, right? And so developing relationships not only with the member but with their key staffers probably important.
Yeah, I think that that's something that is maybe the most unrecognized element on the importance. I came from D.C. and House side staff tended to be a little less long-serving than U.S. Senate staff. I think that's changed a little bit because staff on both sides are getting paid better. The same thing is happening in Salem. I think staff is paid a little better living wage now. And so a lot of the staff that have been there a few terms, I know very well, consider colleagues and friends. But getting to know the new staff and the interns, because you never know when that intern will end up becoming the legislative assistant or the chief of staff. And so you have to give respect to the staff. They're working hard, just like their members and just like those of us on our side.
Yeah, I always tell folks that are coming into the building, be nice to the staff because they're future legislators. Mm-hmm. Personally, I started as an intern in the Oregon State Capitol when I was a teenager.
Yeah,
I was a teenager as a freshman in college, and my freshman the winter term, I guess, January. I ended up as an intern in the Capitol.
Right.
So, it wasn't so 12 years later that I was elected to the legislature.
Right.
So it's kind of how my situation worked.
It's very dangerous if someone comes into the building, and this happens, I think, more with professional lobbyists, but people come into the building and they get upset with a staff person who, I can't get a meeting today. I have to wait 2 weeks. Or where is the senator? He should be there right now to talk to me. Be careful, because that staffer might be related to the senator or the representative. Your mother, one of my favorite staffers of all time, was the staffer for your father, and I'm sure there were people who came in and didn't realize, number one, what a nice, wonderful woman she was, and number two, that she was related to the boss.
Right.
So my counsel is always be nice to staff.
Yeah.
And they deserve that. They deserve respect.
Yeah. No, and staff, I mean, the effectiveness of legislators is really largely on the fact that we have got really, really good staff.
Yeah.
For the most part.
I agree with you.
Makes a difference. Well, anything for kind of closing comments? If, again, the lobbying profession is not a bunch of folks that are trying to take advantage of the public process. Lobbyists are an important part of the legislative process, important source of information for legislators, obviously important for the plethora. I mean, it's virtually every interest that exists. At some point, those interests are going to be legislated at some level. So having advocates in the building makes a difference.
I think so. I mean, the key thing to keep in mind is that, most of us who are in this profession represent real people. We are, we're partners with real people who live in real cities, Redmond, Madras, Sisters, Maupin, McMinnville. We work with people who are going to work every day, trying to get things done, and we are their eyes and ears.
Yeah.
And we're their coordinators, so to speak. So nothing we do is because I believe in I believe in fighting for homeless youth. I believe in fighting for my cities that have a need for, money to fix their streets and for educating, youth who are struggling in school. I mean, I believe in all those things, but I am representing other people who do that work full time in the Capitol, as are you. I mean, your constituents elect you to keep an eye on things for them. So, right. I mean, in essence, legislators are kind of lobbyists too. Well, they're elected to be, but they're a lobbyist. You're lobbying for the interests of
absolutely 100%.
Yamhill County.
Yeah, absolutely 100%. That's right. The legislature's in session right now. We're going to be in session, at least theoretically, all the way through the end of June. I think June 29th is the date for sine die. And then everybody leaves Salem, and in theory, all the legislators go back to their regular jobs, being citizen legislators,
right? Yep.
And lobbyists take off and spend the summer in the Bahamas.
I try to spend the summer on my dirt bike or on a canoe. But,
okay, all right. Well.
Or at a winery in Yamhill County. I live in Newburgh now, but one kind of interesting story, and you remember these days. It used to be that there were no limits to when they got out.
Yeah, believe me, I remember.
One year they went until August 31st.
Long time.
And I remember one of your colleagues, a senator, who I think went to go on his honeymoon in late July, and people said, "Oh no, how can you leave? It's an important time." He came back 10 days later, and nothing had happened, and we adjourned on August 28th. And I will tell you, there's nothing more miserable, as you recall, than being in the Capitol in the summer when everybody else is outside.
Oh, it's terrible. It's a horrible
time.
Yeah, I think that was the 03 session.
Yeah. One year we went to July 31st, and often we're in session until the 4th of July, which so I really like the fact that there are limits.
Yeah.
But I will say that the interim is really an important time, and I put about 32,000 miles on my truck over the previous 18-month interim.
Wow.
And the short session, and that's because I was driving around the state because I try to get out and go to it's easy for me to go to your district. I live next door.
Right. Exactly.
But if I need to go see the legislator from Ontario or Heppner. Or Grants Pass or Ashland, I've got to jump in or the coast. So right. I try to go out and see what's on their mind, what's happening in their district, and see if there are things that they're working on that we could work on together. So there's a lot of busy.
There's a lot of legislative work that gets done in the interim in preparation for legislative sessions.
Right.
And so the work that you do representing your clients, being engaged in those conversations is critically important.
Yep.
Because if you wait until the session starts,
it's too late.
Too late.
Yeah. You really have to do on anything complicated. You've got to do your homework and have educated legislators and answer their questions, because they will have questions before the session starts. Yeah. Otherwise, 9 times out of 10, it's very difficult to get your thing through.
Yeah. Well, I want to wrap up with just your general thought on how the lobbying profession is really public service. While you're paid, well, I'm paid as a legislator,
right.
But it is, I think you would look at kind of your heritage where you had public service models for you and your family. It's not, you're not serving the public through an elected position, but talk how, and then we'll wrap with this, how, what you're doing is really obviously serving your clients, but, I want to frame it kind of in a broader form, broader range of how the lobbying profession ultimately is public service?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, I come from a family of ministers and teachers. So the reason my great-great-grandparents came out on the wagon trail back in the day is they were Methodist ministers. My grandmother's side ended up going in and being one of the 5 families that founded what has now become Oregon State University. They bought Corvallis College, and those ministers turned it into a land grant institution. And then all my family was teachers on both sides of my family. My dad was an educator, my mom was an educator, and that was, to me, that was public service education.
Of course, 100%.
And I occasionally I think I'm not a minister, I'm not an educator. Have I done enough in my life for public service? And I've struggled with that, but I do think that because I believe so strongly in the groups I work with, and I really think they are doing great work, kind of the Lord's work in their community on all facets. I feel like I'm a partner with them and I'm helping them. So I do think that, and I do think that in a kind of a citizen legislative process, which Oregon was set up to be, legislature is not full-time, the legislature is not in session full-time, that there's got to be that partnership between the communities and the elected officials. And so I think my role is to help, share the information that's important in my communities with the people who are going to be making decisions. And so I think that could be defined as public service. I'm not going to give myself that much credit, but I think it's part of the process.
Yeah,
that's
so I think
important to democracy.
I think it is an important part of the process, as ultimately I look at my colleagues that are elected in that building. I look at the staff that support the elected officials. I look at the professional lobby that's in that building on a regular basis. And then obviously we have, citizen lobbyists that are passionate about issues that are in the building. Mm-hmm. I look at all of that is how we, kind of all mushed up together, smashed together, are serving Oregonians. Yeah. And each of those parts has an important role to play. Yeah. And at the end of the day, we're going to sine die on, June 30 or June 29th or before, and we're going to have a balanced budget.
Correct.
And we're going to pass some laws that I wholeheartedly disagree with. And there's going to be a whole bunch of them that pass nearly unanimously where we work together. And it's because we have this mashup of interest groups and folks that, like yourself, that represent rural Oregonians that can't make it to the building, staff, legislators, interest groups, all mashed together in this kind of crazy sausage making kind of thing. And at the end of the day, more or less, it works.
Yeah. It's I'm sure other people said this, but didn't Ronald Reagan say it's the worst form of government except for every other form of government?
Right. A quote, that was a paraphrase, but but you got the point. Exactly. And it's the most horrible thing ever except for everything else.
Everything else is more horrible, right? It's like sausage making.
You don't want to watch it.
Yeah, don't want to watch it.
Yeah.
And it is often not pleasant and it's very stressful, but I think people in the building are well-meaning. Yep. Legislators are well-meaning. There really are, I've seen maybe on one hand the number of legislators who I really thought didn't have the goals of the state in mind. Now, everyone might not always agree with them, but I think people are well-meaning on both sides of the aisle, and that the democratic process that is set up in Oregon still is very democratic.
Yeah. Well, as we close, I really appreciate the time this morning. I hope that as folks listen and watch this, they understand how that role between legislator and lobbyist is complementary, and the role that the lobby really plays in helping to make the system work ultimately. So appreciate your time this morning, Doug.
Yeah, appreciate your time and appreciate your service.
Happy to do it.
Yeah.